Welcome to our presentation. This is a study of the what and the how of teaching in EMI classrooms in the Japanese university context. My name is Mark Anthony de Boer, and I'm from Akita International University in Japan.
My name is Natalia Vnitskaya, and I'm from Universitat Internacional de Catalunya from Spain. Today in our presentation, we're going to explain our ongoing collaborative study, and we'll start with presenting conceptual background to the theoretical frameworks we're using in our study. Then we'll move on to methodology, where we'll describe the context, participants, and the analytical procedures we followed. And then we'll show the preliminary results that we will discuss in the light of the conceptual frameworks, and then we'll conclude with some pedagogical implications. The first theoretical framework that we adopted in our study is Legitimation Code Theory, and more specifically, its semantic dimension. It allows to look at what teachers do when they teach, and more specifically, look at whether they scaffold students' disciplinary understanding of the content, whether teachers introduce and demonstrate and discuss new knowledge. Do they unpack it into everyday knowledge and then bring it back into academic disciplinary knowledge? And for this, Legitimation Code Theory proposes two parameters, semantic gravity and semantic density. So let's have a look at semantic density and semantic gravity. What are they? Semantic density means that the teacher is using disciplinary language to explain and to teach abstract, complex, disciplinary content and knowledge. And in this case, the semantic density is stronger. However, when the teacher is using everyday language, everyday language and familiar concepts and draws on, for example, on students' previous knowledge, then the semantic density can be coded as weaker. When this knowledge and content is contextualized, so when the teacher provides visuals or uses reality in the classroom or refers to something projected on the screen or written on the board, then the content is highly contextualized, and it means that the semantic gravity is stronger. However, when this contextualizing is missing and the teacher is not using other means to help students understand dense and complex content, then semantic gravity is weaker. So when we combine these two parameters, semantic gravity and semantic density, we have a matrix with 4 possible codes. And we start with the first one, with the situations in the classroom when the teacher deals with everyday and familiar content, using everyday language and providing lots of content. For example, using realia or visuals or referring to something written on the board. And these instances can be coded as prosaic. There are other moments in the classroom when the teacher still deals with simple content and familiar knowledge using simple language. However, there is no context provided. And then these moments in the teaching process are coded as verified. When we move on along the teaching process, there are other moments when the teacher uses dense and academic language, however, contextualizing and providing, again, context to help students understand this more abstract and complex knowledge. And then these instances in the teaching process are coded as worldly. And finally, the most challenging moments in the classroom are when the teacher is using dense and academic language, disciplinary language, to deal with abstract and complex content, and there is no context. So again, for students have no reference to understand better the content in the classroom. This combination of codes, when we put them together, they can help us represent the teaching process as a wave, where the teacher starts with the content, with the concept, and then moving into everyday using everyday language and using reality, using visuals, the teacher can unpack this dense concept, making it comprehensible for students. And in the following moment, repacking it back into academic language, into disciplinary language, and into disciplinary specific knowledge. And then again, moving into next theory or next phenomena, and again, moving into these processes of unpacking and repacking.
The second theoretical framework that we're using in our study is the construct of cognitive discourse functions. Well, these are a way of looking at how the content is articulated through linguistic means. For example, if a teacher is going to be categorizing or comparing something, then he's using or she's using the language to look at those two concepts, but in a way that articulates a comparison. So in other words, there's a cognitive function to this because the teacher has to know these concepts, or the students have to know these concepts in order for them to understand what's being compared conceptually, but also how to articulate it so that I know I'm doing the comparison. So in other words, it's a way of linking linguistic representations to cognitive learning goals, both for the teacher and for the student. There are 7 types of CDFs, from categorize to report, and each of them have a communicative intention. Okay, the context and participants that we used in this study came from a liberal arts university in northern Japan. We drew from 3 courses. Each course was for 15 weeks, twice a week, and each class was a 75-minute class. The teachers that are used in this study are experienced EMI lecturers, but they didn't have any specific EMI or CLIL training. The students that are in the study are all Japanese students, L1, and they are about the English B2 level of the CFR. So the first course that we looked at is the Introduction to Fundamentals of Chemistry. This is an optional lecture. The teacher is an English native speaker, and this is, because it's optional, there are not that many students in this class. There was only 8 students participating, and they come from 2nd and 3rd year. The second course we looked at was Political Science. This is an obligatory course. The teacher is a Japanese native speaker, and students are primarily 2nd and 3rd year, and there were 39 students in this class. And then the last class we looked at was Poetry of Programming. This is obligatory. And the teacher is an English non-native speaker. And the students come from anywhere from 2nd to 4th year, and there were 16 students in this classroom.
Our data corpus consists of 9 video recorded sessions, out of which we selected 3 15-minute excerpts from the 3 lessons, from chemistry, political science, and poetry of programming. And we used qualitative content analysis and the specialized software Atlas.ti to identify the cognitive discourse functions that the teachers used in each lesson, and also the semantic codes that were used to deal with the disciplinary content.
Okay, so when we put the coding together, we look at the graphs for these particular instances in our classrooms, we can see how the lesson looks from the semantic gravity and semantic identity perspectives. So when the 2 lines are coincide at the top of the graph, this is a case where a rhizomatic incident is happening in the classroom. Where the 2 lines coincide at the bottom of the graph, this is an example of where prosaic is happening in the classroom. When the semantic density is strong at the top of the graph, and we have the semantic gravity at the bottom of the graph, well, this is an example of worldly. And rarefied is an example where the gravity line is at the top of the graph and the semantic density line is at the bottom of the graph. And so this tells us, through looking at these kinds of graphs, what is happening in the classroom at each particular point of the lesson.
We use these analytical approaches in conceptual frameworks, analytical approaches to explore classroom interaction in the EMI context in terms of the CDFs and how what CDFs are realized in the teaching and learning process, and how knowledge is constructed through semantic codes and semantic waves. So we start the presentation of results with the cognitive discourse functions that were identified across the 3 lessons. As we can see in this graph, the most prominent ones and the most used ones were explain, categorize, and report. And what does it mean? It means that independently of the disciplines across the 3 lessons, the teachers were mainly explaining the phenomena, the concepts. They were categorizing, so classifying and comparing phenomena and concepts, and they were also reporting, so informing, presenting factual information specific to their disciplines.
So the first extract comes from the atomic theory lesson, and we look at the CDFs here. The teacher is using explain through categorize. So by explaining this phenomenon, he's actually comparing the different sizes of the atoms with each other.
In example 2, that comes from executive branch lesson, the teacher is presenting and informing factual information about the political parties, so reporting using defining different parties projected on the screen. In example 3, that comes from programming functions lesson, we see how the teacher is informing about the way how coding formulas work. In another example, again from programming functions lesson, the teacher is comparing 2 components, 2 parts of the coding formula.
Okay, what do we see here in the semantic codes then across these 3 lessons? Well, we see that the rhizomatic and worldly were the most used. Okay, well, what does this mean? Well, for example, worldly, it means that the teachers used a lot of contextualization in the classroom, things like the whiteboard, realia, or PowerPoint presentations, but at the same time used a lot of the academic language to discuss what was on the board or what the students were seeing. In the rhizomatic case, which we see next, this case, the teachers were still using a lot of the academic language and difficult concepts, but at the same time, they were not contextualizing these. In other words, there was nothing on the screen or nothing on the board that the students were able to look at to understand what the teacher was talking about. So it was decontextualized. So for example, here in this atomic theory lesson, what we see here is the teacher is using a dense language. He's using the academic language of the chemistry, periodic table, electron, sodium, chlorine, energy, removing electrons. But at the same time, he is using on the whiteboard a projection of the periodic table, and he's showing the trends in the periodic table. So it's context dependent, contextualized. So he's showing something at the same time as he's discussing them. In this case here, in the executive branch lesson, we see it's rhizomatic, context independent, and dense. Well, what does this mean? Well, the teacher is using largely academic language, difficult concepts, but at the same time, the teacher is not showing something on the whiteboard or PowerPoint. In other words, the students are listening, but they haven't got something to contextualize what she is or he is talking about. In this case here, in the programming functions lesson, the teacher is providing a real-life example of this idea of hash map. In other words, he's showing something that's context-dependent, it's contextualized, but he's also using everyday simple language to show this. The word corridor, lockers, key, and that makes it easy for the students to understand this context-dependent, prosaic example. Okay. On the other hand, we see this context-dependent. In other words, the teacher is now sitting in front of the computer and he's typing things into the computer so the students can see this. It's context-dependent, it's contextualized. Okay, and he's showing this hash map. He's using the academic dense language. So in other words, it's not every day. It's using the language of the academic, but he's contextualizing it by using the whiteboard and writing the things on the computer screen. So what do we see here now if we look at the semantic waves that we discussed previously? Well, this is the atomic theory lesson. And you can see the orange line across the top is primarily what we see as semantic density as being strong, or the teacher is using dense academic language and academic concepts for the classroom. Okay, so we see this consistently across. There's a few places at the end of the lesson where the teacher is using more everyday language or less abstract concepts, but for the most part, this semantic density is strong. Where on the other hand, the teacher is using a lot of things in the classroom to demonstrate. He's using reality. There's things on the whiteboard, or he's projecting things on the screen to contextualize what he's talking about. So it gives the student something to understand and something to see. And he's also going through and showing things on the whiteboard and drawing things and writing things so the students can see what he's writing, and at the same time as him using these kinds of languages. So there's a lot of contextualization, but there's also a lot of semantic density and a lot of academic language being used here. In the executive branch semantic waves, we see maybe something similar, but what we see primarily is, yes, there's a lot of semantic density, which is strong. The teacher's using academic concepts that are specific for the political science, but at the same time, you can see that throughout the lesson, she's resorting to more everyday language and comparisons and making things easier for the students to understand. At the same time, there are things that she's contextualizing, but at the same time, there are things that she's not contextualizing. So there's a more even distribution of the waves, as we see in this lesson. And in the programming lesson, okay, what we see here is, again, the semantic density is primarily strong throughout the lesson, but there are some examples where he does bring in everyday language, but primarily it's more the concepts that are specific for programming. But at the same time, the teacher uses the whiteboard to contextualize and to show examples of what he's actually talking about, as well as we saw, programming, and we're typing things on the computer screen, and as well as using the whiteboard and the PowerPoint projections to show, again, the kinds of things that he is talking about. So we see in this lesson here, there's a lot of contextualization and decontextualization, and there's a lot of semantic density. In other words, a lot of academic language being used.
We see that what we've found in terms of the how of teaching in my classroom, so how the teaching process was conducted in the three classrooms. In terms of the semantic codes, we saw that across the disciplines and independently of the disciplines in all lessons, the wordly code, which means that the language used by the teacher and the concepts explained by the teacher, by each teacher in each lesson, they were dense and abstract and complex. However, they were often contextualized, either through realia or examples, or using the whiteboard or the projected slides. So this code was the most prominent, and it was followed by the rhizomatic code, where again the teacher was maintaining the highly academic and dense discourse. However, it was even void of context. So there were no other references that students could have to understand that dense and abstract knowledge. The resulting semantic waves, as Mark has explained, show that in atomic theory and programming functions, in these two lessons, the teachers mostly use dense and abstract concepts to construct academic knowledge, and often in a decontextualized way. However, they referred to disciplinary bits of text they had written prior on the whiteboard, or which were projected on the screen, to provide some context for this dense and abstract academic knowledge and language. However, we found that it was more frequent in the atomic theory lesson. On the opposite side, in the executive branch lesson, the teacher regularly unpacked abstract concepts using everyday language, providing examples, illustrating, and then repacking back into dense academic knowledge. So as we see, semantic waves were more balanced. In terms of how it was done linguistically, so the language that the teachers used when they were moving between the academic language and dense and abstract knowledge and everyday language and back, so unpacking and repacking, we see that across the three languages and independently of the disciplines, the teachers were mainly explaining concepts and content. They were categorizing, they were often classifying or comparing concepts. They were also informing or presenting factual information.
So the conclusions and pedagogical implications. Well, what we see is throughout the, although the teachers explained concepts or categorized or compared phenomenon and reported the factual information, there weren't many instances where the students were asked to hypothesize or speculate or guess, i.e. The CDF explore. And also there were no further elaboration of ideas with well-supported arguments. And this is directly related to critical thinking skills. So if students are asked to hypothesize or speculate or guess about specific phenomenon, it allows them to think about what they're actually learning critically. Okay, so what do the semantic waves indicate? Well, the semantic waves indicate that the teachers should have language knowledge for content teaching, which means they should be aware of how difficult and dense this disciplinary content and specialized language might be, especially for students in the L2. It also indicates that teachers need to more often contextualize disciplinary content through example, for example, realia or something on the whiteboard or some sort of PowerPoint example to help, or even through simple language, to help unpack this academic language. It also indicates that maybe using projected slides with dense and abstract information may be insufficient to support students' understanding of the content. So what we see here in this graph here is maybe an ideal lesson where the teacher starts off the class with a concept that's dense and highly academic and decontextualized, but immediately unpacks it for the students in a way that is contextualized, but also uses everyday language and maybe comparisons with things that the students already know. So then, little by little, the teacher will start to repack this information by bringing in the academic language again, and maybe some decontextualization. So in other words, this is an area where the teacher is repacking the information so that by the time the lesson is finished, the students have an understanding of the concept, and they have an understanding of the concept in the academic language. Okay, so we want to conclude by saying that there's a need for EMI teaching courses to be focused on language knowledge for content teaching. And as we saw in the previous graph, how to unpack and repack this complex disciplinary knowledge in the classroom during the lesson. And also to focus on using a wider range of cognitive discourse functions, especially those that require students' critical thinking. For example, explore, which means getting students to hypothesize or to speculate or to guess. And thank you very much for listening to our presentation.
Muchas gracias por su atención.